Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Usama Bilal, and I'm here, the co-director of the Urban Health Collaborative here at Drexel. Hi to everyone on Zoom, including those joining us. Today's speaker event has been organized by the UHC and supported by the World Fair project funded by the European Commission. If you want to learn more about the World Fair project, you can check the website at worldfair-project.eu. Today, we have a very exciting talk by Dr. Theresa Anderson. She's the Director and Chief Data and AI Ethicist at Connecting Stones. Based in Australia, she's an award-winning scholar and practitioner with nearly 30 years of experience tackling the challenges of information, data, and ethical technologies. After an earlier career in international security and diplomacy, Theresa shifted her attention to information sciences, becoming an academic at the University of Technology in Sydney. A social informaticist with a PhD in information science, she served as director and associate professor of the university's inaugural Human-Centered and Transdisciplinary Postgraduate Data Science program from 2014 to 2018. Theresa now focuses on advancing socially just data policies and building trusted environments for data and AI use. She contributes to the development of reference and actionable frameworks at local and international levels, including the New South Wales State Government inaugural Artificial Intelligence Advisory and Review Committee, and as an expert contributor for an international standard for data usage. She's also a data ethics advisor to the International Science Council Committee on Data, CODATA, where she contributes to the World Fair project, shaping cultures of care in relation to data policy and practice. If you have any questions during the talk, please, you are on Zoom, input it on the Zoom Q&A function, or wait till the end and raise your hand. Likewise, if you are in person. Thank you, Theresa, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Osama, and thank you to the Urban Health Collective for hosting me, for bringing me here to speak. It's my first event and adventure outside of Australia since COVID, so it still feels rather surreal. And it's been really wonderful to be able to be here and share with colleagues the work of World Fair, to be with Anna and Ron, who have done work with me before, and to be able to start to connect and think about ways that we might in the future continue to work on these shared interests together. So I want to talk about data in relation to AI and the ways that we can contribute to meaningful work for community benefit. And before I begin, because community is so important, I want to acknowledge country and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we are sitting, both here in what is now called Philadelphia, and paying respect to my home space, which is now called Bunbury, but was called Goomba by the Wadandi community who lived there for 45,000 years. That's a very long history of experience and story and data collection. And so it's one reason that CARE as a philosophy coming from the Indigenous Data Alliance has really resonated with me because of where I sit. So I also want to pay respect to any Indigenous First Nations people who are in the room or who are listening on Zoom or might be hearing this in the future in a recording. So acknowledging country is a very important part of Australian engagement in public spaces and recognizing the challenges of European occupation of a country that has a long history. The part where I am, so down in that little corner where the blue arrow is, so that is the lands that's Noongar country, and the tribe that is part of the home where I now sit are the Wadandi people, who sit on some of the oldest rock in Australia, which makes it some of the oldest exposed lands of occupation. But what this picture shows you, and this you can find if you look at an IAPA map of Australia, this shows you the representation of countries and communities from these Indigenous peoples in a very different way than a political map that you might see of Australia today. So Australia has 7 states and territories. When you look at this, there are over 150, and I really encourage you to have a look and explore that. And the reason I wanted to flag that is because when you look at this representation, then this illustration that it was created in 1992 by an Indigenous elder, creating an artful representation of story and connection across Australia, is mapping the process of storytelling and meeting and greeting and understanding, moving from one community to the next. And what I've always loved about this depiction is how, by showing those connections one step at a time, you get the same representation of Australia that you would get if you were taking a Landsat satellite photo today. But it's done at the ground, it's done with the people, and it's done through personal interchange. So the other reason I wanted to flag this is because I think there's a message in this that's really important, which is about making time for listening to and sharing stories. So this map was built up over time, but it was done by making the time to connect and to understand and to see where there is similarity and difference. And there's a valuable message in that for us. So I want to share a few, I guess, I hate to call them truths, values and messages that have been very important in the work that I do, that I'm seeking to bring into the work of the artificial intelligence policy contribution that I've been able to make, and the work that I've been able to do with CoData in relation to constructing data that contributes to community benefit. And the first point is to say, well, data matters. And I think when we're talking about artificial intelligence, it's really important to go back to that fundamental truth, because data is what feeds an artificial intelligence system. Without having data, the AI really can't necessarily function, at least at the moment. I know over time, there's synthetic data and there's instruction, but what we're talking about really is a recognition that it's the data that is the fuel of this. So I like metaphor. I'm going to talk in a moment about data as water, but if you think of data as food, I see that here in this reference from Tim Berners-Lee, this idea that data is this precious thing that's going to last far longer than the systems. Data changes. If I recall the 48,000-year history of the Noongar people in the area where I now live, there's a lot of data that has been collected over that time, and it continues to be shaped and reshaped and transformed as technologies continue to evolve. So I want to share a story thinking about data as water that goes back also to some of my own family history, which has shaped the way that I engage with these topics. In a lot of what I do, I seek to honor the experience and the trauma that my parents experienced. My parents are part of the diaspora from Central Europe at the end of the Second World War. My family traced their history on my father's side to an area that no longer exists on a map, that was cleared to make space for what became the Iron Curtain. So there is a story of displacement in my family that is nothing like the stories of displacement of peoples dealing with forced migration today. But in a small way, it helped me to understand the consequences of dealing with circumstances beyond your control that shape your present and your future, individually and as a community. So where my parents' families sit, they were part of a community that existed in a place. They were gifted land by the King of Bohemia 950 years ago, and they were there until the Iron Curtain went up and political boundaries changed. What I wanted to share here is this picture of the city of Passau. So Passau is the largest urban area that sits close to the area where three countries meet that were important in my family history, what is now the Czech Republic, Austria, and Germany. And what you see here is a meeting of three waters. You see the Danube here, you see the Inn up here, and the Ilz here. So the Ilz is a river that comes from Bohemia. It's very dark and tannic, and it traces its lineage to the farms where my family come from. The Danube is the river of song, of music, doesn't always look blue, I'm afraid. And the Inn is a green river that comes down from the Alps in Austria, and it's a frigid river, and it's this really intense green color that comes in. Now, as a child, when I was visiting this place, I was fascinated by these three rivers coming together, and the fact, if you can just sort of see where they swirl, particularly up here, you start to see this mixing and this marbling of the colors. And so as a child, it really intrigued me. Okay, where is the Danube in this? Because these all become, from that point where the photo ends, that is the Danube. The inn has disappeared. The ilz has disappeared. And yet those molecules of water that are in the ilz and the inn, they're in the Danube. Now they've lost their name. They've lost their identity, but they still carry the memory and the story of the places where they were. That green water from the Alps brings with it the sediment that becomes part of the Danube as it moves to the Black Sea. And the tannic coloring of the ilz moves into the Danube. And so I used to put my hand in where the three go to sort of see, okay, which one am I in? You know, there's a game that my family used to play where you go up to the border, you're like, okay, one leg is in this country, one leg is here, and one is there. So where am I? So for me, you know, that was how I grew up, sort of seeing the transitory state of borders and boundaries, and thinking about how contested those spaces are. Now, I think that applies to data, because if you think about those molecules of water that come from these places that now carry into this other thing that has a new name, they still exist and yet they don't. And so it's important to be minded of the fact that these borders are porous and that there are edge cases. So there are situations right here where, in terms of defining these things, they might defy pure classification. And at a certain point, it is really important to appreciate the difference. Go on, I'll get carried away, so I'll behave and move forward a little bit. Because what I think that says to us, and this is a quote from my former boss when I was working in a learning analytics program, Simon Buckingham-Shum. And I love this notion that data points in a graph are just tiny portholes into a rich human world. So it doesn't mean that we don't work with data. It doesn't mean that we treat it with honor and respect and find ways to make sure that we maintain its quality and integrity. But if we think that that data represents all of a human who is supposedly represented in those numbers and those values, then there is a problem, because they are just proxy indicators that can never do justice. So again, we're working with this, but we're also recognizing the limitation. Who we are, where we are, and what we are can never be fully represented in the spreadsheets that come to represent people. So that means it's important to see that naming matters and categorization matters. So how we name things is connected to our language. So the city of Bunbury, a Western name. Leschenault, the estuary where I live, a Western name that actually comes from one of the French explorers that supposedly named a place that Europeans thought didn't have a name. And yet it was, in Noongar, it was Ilau. So that name matters. I love this work from Mary Ellen Kabak, who looks quite a lot at the challenges of diversity and inclusivity and the power of language. And so to think of language as one of the most intimate and most political of human activities really resonates with me when I think of how important it is for us when we're working with data to be conscious of the power of what we name and what we categorize and connect. So I want to give you an example. That comes from classifications near to the heart of working in public health. So this is an ethnography, sorting things out, that was done by Chris will know, Jeff Bowker and Lee Starr. So in information science, this for me, this rocked my world, this book, looking at as an ethnography of the classification of diseases. So tracing the way that this document, this treatise was created and how it has evolved. And so working as an information science educator to realize that classification is theoretical was profound. And it has stuck with me as I've moved into data science. So remembering that organizing information and organizing data really is a political act. So again, it doesn't mean that we don't do it, but it means that we recognize that there are power relations at play. And often the people who have the authority to name have that authority because of some choices and decisions that have been made potentially to advantage one group or idea at the expense of another. So what I like to say is, we be mindful of that. We recognize that something that we think is seemingly technical actually can have these profound political and human consequences. So here's some examples of classifications as powerful technologies. One of my favorites, I was talking yesterday with some people after the panel session, this 17th century casualties list. You can find this. I've put some links together to share from sorting things out. The first 3 chapters are publicly available. I would highly recommend the book. And in those first chapters, you'll see a conversation around this table of casualties from England, 1649, where one cause of death is wolf, another cause of death, mother. Very compelling. You could die of grief. So what's interesting is you could die by mother, but not by father. There was no classification. And so over time, clearly, these causes of death have evolved and emerged. So we don't list cause of death by grief. We don't list wolves. Wolves no longer exist in England, so it's kind of a useless classification. And this is important then when you're starting to link data. This is why this is important, even if you're not using a table from 1649. What is the context that shaped that particular document? So tuberculosis was listed as the king's evil. So until I did history to find out that the king's evil was TB, I was thinking, what, is the king going around wreaking havoc? So let's fast forward then to this table from an earlier historic version of the International Classification of Diseases that lists as a disease old age. So as I move into that stage of life, it's very depressing to think that I have a disease. And within that was a subset, old age senility. So again, these labels are no longer used, but also old age is no longer seen as a disease. It is a stage of life. So now a more recent example from 2018. I really like this paper. And again, this is freely available. I would recommend this. This goes into the classification around the idea of chronic fatigue syndrome, which for a long time was classed as a psychological disorder, using that language. And I have a friend who endured years of battles with doctors to be seen as actually having physical symptoms. So we have shifted our understanding, and it is now recognized as a medical physical condition, but it still brings with it challenges in terms of engaging with a patient and trying to understand how to sensitively deal with this, and also how to change the classification systems to recognize this. So this paper focuses on the English context and the challenge around dealing with that transition. So, these are ongoing issues. So with all this, to me, the mantra that I use for this is to make the invisible visible, to find ways to make sure that we recognize that data and classifications are given a voice. And that means that algorithms are given a voice as well. They aren't set in stone. They are created by humans. And so they're giving a view that is shaped by the people who are building them. Now that becomes increasingly complex now when we start to have these automated ways of building algorithmic engagements with large data sets. But nonetheless, it is really important to appreciate the human hand in this. And I love this work from Dana Boyd and Kate Crawford, saying we must ask difficult questions of big data's models, because we need to be sure that we're not crystallizing some of those inequities into the new orthodoxies, the new ways of doing things. So again, it's not that we don't work with this, but I think we need to be minded. I think we need to appreciate that algorithms like categories are human. They are products of humans. And therefore, I would contest the idea that data is a single source of truth and that data is in and of itself evidence. That doesn't mean it can't be part of an evidentiary base, but it is not the sole source of evidence. And that, I trained in ethnography, and when I was doing my thesis, it was really hard for me to convince a traditionally quantitative community that I had evidence. So I ended up having to go through all sorts of different hoops to make sure that I could show that what I claimed was verifiable. So I think that kind of practice is something that all of us should think about. All of us should be able to find ways to explain and articulate and evidence our claims. So that doesn't mean you don't use it as a body of evidence, but it is not the single source of evidence. And so this becomes really critical. Again, data is given a voice. It doesn't speak for itself. Who is giving it that voice? And now increasingly, when we're working with artificial intelligence and machine learning and technologies that are working in ways that we are not necessarily always fully aware of, those inequities and those imbalances almost become, not always, but can become magnified like a megaphone. That inequity can explode. So recognizing that actions like classification and recognition and prediction will be shaped by assumptions that are baked into the work that went into the design of the categories or the design of the function that you're asking a system to perform is a really important point to keep in mind. And so those were some of the underlying premises, if you like, that shaped the way that I worked with data science students when I had the privilege to run a data science program. And so it was about embedding this idea of data humanism and seeing the human in the data within the work of data scientists. So it doesn't mean, I think I was saying to someone yesterday, it's not the either or, it's not human or machine, it's the and. It's bringing all of that together. And so I just wanted to give a snapshot of 3 of the graduate attributes that were, from my mind, a really important way of underpinning human values alongside the technical training that is associated with making sure that you can be a data scientist and you have the understanding and the capacity to work with systems and data tools. So one thing is making the invisible visible, finding ways to make sure you're recognizing and addressing the missing, the misrepresented and the underrepresented that's in data. You're trying to embrace your ethical responsibilities by interrogating and justifying those responsibilities within your framework of practice. So that's, again, that comes to that idea of evidencing and documenting your work. So in ethnography, there's a lot of talk about showing your hand. When I worked with a community, it's very important to be able to document and evidence claims and to make sure that I'm also doing referential checks and ensuring that the community has a voice in anything that I'm seeking to say. So that is a practice that we can take into our data work. And also, I think it's important working in this space to have a voice and to speak to the injustices that you see, to develop the courage and to develop the networks that allow you to have the courage to speak when you see something that isn't appropriate. To not play, I don't know if it's in America, but in Britain and in Australia, the comedy show Little Britain plays. Does that ring a bell? So there's this scene where, you know, the characters are like, oh no, the computer says no. You know, can't do it, the computer says no. So if the computer is saying no, and you, as a technologist, recognize that there should be a yes, that's where we should feel strong enough to speak up to that. And that's not easy to do. So learning to take leadership in promoting positive change is also, I think, a part of the training of data scientists. And that's because people matter. So it's not that data doesn't matter, data matters, but the people part of this is very important as well. And I'll go back. So I've studied the history of technologies and looking at the future from a past lens. So some of my favorite, 1649, it's great to imagine what the world would be like. If you look at some of the letters between the first librarian of Oxford's Bodleian Library and the funder, where they talk about there's just so much information and I don't know how I'm going to get this all in this library. And that's 1609. You go, okay, yeah, you think you had problems. So these are all contextual. So John Naisbitt, talking in a sense about what was going to happen in the 21st century back in 1982, that the most exciting breakthroughs will not be because of technology, but because of an expanding concept of what it means to be human. And in many ways, I think that is happening. I think it was happening before COVID, but I think particularly what I see in the ways that we as a society and as a planet have been dealing with, what I see is the ways that we are facing the challenges of this climate crisis, the climate wars, as they're referenced, is all about what does it mean to be human in this world today and what kind of future can we craft? So I want to give just a quick snapshot to help us in the first instance to think about the workers and the work that is done in this new so-called revolution of artificial intelligence by looking at a past moment of industrial revolution and change. So, you know, I can remember learning in history, okay, the Industrial Revolution had a lot to do with the development of mechanical tools that made work easier because there was this thing called a steam engine that could operate at a faster pace than a human hand. And one of those tools was the cotton gin that became mechanical and then increasingly operated by speed. And what the cotton gin enabled was a faster processing of cotton. But that faster processing, that meant that there was now a machine that needed to be fed with more cotton at a faster pace. And how did that happen? So that happened, there's a correlation that emerged between the development of this new way of processing cotton and the growth of plantations and the slave labor that then became the only way that this machine could be fed at the pace that the economy started to rely on. So when you see certain narratives of the Industrial Revolution, enabling development and enabling an improved life, that certainly is not the case for all of the work, all the labor that was underpinning that new economy. So now let's fast forward to AI, and AI described as the fourth industrial revolution and the future of work. I'm not sure about you, but in Australia, you see a lot of descriptions about how work will be so much easier because all that effort that you have to go through to deal with things by hand is now liberated. And I feel this personally. One of my first jobs when I studied here in Philadelphia, I had to manually sift through card records, remember, card catalogs, and trying to transliterate the work. And then I had a job where I had to read all the papers that came out of the Soviet Union and manually translate what was going on and look at photos of who was standing on Lenin's tomb and try to work out what relationship is there, what is the untold story of this photo. And that was a very laborious job. That is all done, for decades now, that has been done by a machine through image analysis. Now, I'm not sad to see that part disappear from a human role, but what that machine can't do is all the if you like, the meaning making about those images. So now let's move to recent developments with AI, and this is a snapshot of an office in India where it is the responsibility of all these women to basically label and name images, because it's all well and good to have AI that allows you to work with images and to deal with some of these tools that will mean that I, as an end user, don't have to do that. But those labels come from somewhere, and that mechanical work is in if you like, a digital sweatshop, as it's often referred to. So again, in this context, as it says here, this is not necessarily the futurist work that is promised by AI. So there are people in these chains. There is displacement that we need to be mindful of. So I think this idea of humanizing our work is a really important mindset to take into everything that we're doing. And again, not because we can control all of that, but because it just sensitizes us to those issues, to the unintended consequences. Another aspect is in terms of who is represented in the data. And Hannah Wallach, this is another scientist and thinker that I can highly recommend that you explore if you haven't come across her work. So this piece in 2014 was written in Medium, and she's worked quite a lot on FAIR of a different sort in AI. So FAIR as a concept is used in a number of places. And I just love this idea that, in order to responsibly articulate and address the issues of bias and fairness and inclusion, we have to stop thinking of these big data sets as homogeneous, that there are lots of subclasses in there. We need to shift to the diversity that is nested within those. So what she seeks to bring to her work is a social science mindset, working with social data and bringing that into computational work. And that seems a very valuable insight. So I'll go back to a specific example. How am I doing for time? A specific example from my own work. So 20 years ago, I was finishing up my PhD, and I was working in information science, and I, for my sins, was tackling the underlying concept of relevance. So relevance drives the way that in information retrieval, it is determined whether or not a search query matches with a document. And so the frustration I was having as a user was, okay, well, my view, so I don't expect you to memorize or even see this, but you'll see these calculations that precision and recall, which came to be seen and still are the measures of efficiency for an information retrieval system, are assuming that relevance is some sort of a standard and relevance is somehow fixed. And what was increasingly happening in information science at the time when I was a student was an understanding that from a human perspective, that isn't how it worked. Because individuals have different ways of judging relevance, and they have different ways of situating and locating meaning making in their individual contexts, or even in the context of particular communities. But it's hard to believe now, looking at Chris as someone from that domain, it's hard to imagine that back then it was radical to try to explore information retrieval from a human perspective. I mean, call me crazy, wanting to understand how people actually work. And so I was lucky, the very moment I was doing this research, was, at least at my university, there was the introduction of networked information systems. So I was witnessing the ways that scholars who were breaking new ground were finding information. So the two questions I asked them for 2 years as I witnessed their work was, what are you looking for and how do you know when you found it? And what it led to was this realization, as Paul says, is, there's a co-authoring of meaning making that happens, that the relevance was not set in stone, but it was this dynamic fluid process. And what that led to was the work that underpins everything that I've done since then around the relationship between creativity, uncertainty, and risk, and how human notions of uncertainty are very different from the ways that uncertainty is instantiated in systems. So often uncertainty is something that we seek to avoid because it's problematic from a system standpoint. We need to have certainty to be able to move forward. But humans, actually, if you look at our history as people, as existing on this planet, uncertainty is how we move forward. If everything's certain, what's the point? So life is an adventure, but there can also be too much uncertainty, and there's problematic uncertainty. So what I sought to do was develop this framework where I tried to recognize how to help individuals and organizations to start to navigate between this tension between structure and unstructured, between plan and play. I won't go into detail here, but I've shared a link to some of the work about that, and I'd love to engage with you further about it. Because really what this is about is, as a heuristic, finding the sweet spot in the middle through practice. Finding out how to make sure that there is sufficient structure, because structure and pressure actually does enable us to get work done. But too much pressure can make it hard to actually allow your best thinking to come out through contemplative work, pauses, and through playful engagement with ideas. In order to move forward in an uncertain world, this is why trust matters. And so the last few years, I've really sought to focus on ways that I can help build and sustain trust relations in organizations and in communities in relation to working with data and AI technologies. Because we're dealing with a trust deficit, as so many people talk about. There's a great deal of distrust and mistrust. And it becomes problematic when you're trying to work with community in particular, because I love this work. Nyland did some work on privacy and surveillance in the UK. And this comes out of his work, this idea that trust underpins or makes possible social action. It allows us to move forward. In other work, there's this idea that trust is how you leap into an uncertain future. It's how we individually know to move forward. I trust the floor will be there. If I don't trust the floor is there, then I'm hesitant. I trust that I will be protected when I'm in certain spaces where I'm told that this is a safe space. And over experience. So yesterday, for instance, Amy was talking about the problem in communities that just have had, too many bad experiences with researchers coming in. And so they've lost that trust. And the problem is, once trust is broken, it is very hard to rebuild. So it's really, to me, fundamental in the work that we do to be privileging trust. And so it becomes really important, I think, when we're talking about AI technologies, because, there's a lot of conversation now about, AI for good. And I strongly support the intention behind people working. I'm part of communities like Women in AI, where our aspiration is to use AI for good. But I go back to a statement from Aristotle. The good of a human being relates to being human. So that's why humans matter. And all knowledge and every pursuit aims to be at some good. But what do we mean by good? So how is good defined? That comes back to that evidencing again. And if we're going to code human values into AI, what are those values and how have they been defined? And how do we know that they are good? And who are they good for? What might be privileged in that process? So these are just some of the frameworks that I've been a part of, working and contributing to in Australia. Our ISO standards, so Standards Australia contributed to standards for data sharing and use that have just been accepted by the International Standards Organization. And those are available. I'm happy to share some of that if you like. But it goes to, I think, an important aspect in the midst of all these standards talking about trying to be responsible and good. There's a lesson to be learned from the trust deficit that we're experiencing at the moment, because to be responsible is one thing, but to socialize what you mean by responsible and good with communities is a really important step. And it isn't done solely by having a document that says, here are our steps. I'm thinking about the conversation we had about fair and care yesterday. And, you know, Ron, as you were flagging, it's great to have these fabulous principles that say, this is what we aim to do, but it's the operationalizing of that where it becomes really challenging. And I would say when we're working for community benefit, it's the socializing of that in communities and ensuring that you understand their position and what it takes for them to feel secure and trusted. But it's not just building up that understanding within, say, a general community. It's really important to do that within an organization that is seeking to do good. So this is a snapshot from the AI assurance framework that I have had the privilege to be a part of in New South Wales government, where we became the first committee of its kind in Australia to evaluate the use of AI projects within a government framework. And what we started with was a set of principles that were shaped in the first instance by the chief data scientist in conjunction with work that was being done internationally and nationally, and then socialized with a committee that included a diverse group of men and women who work in different areas of community, law, and technology. And over time, we came up with not just a way to help operationalize those principles, but to also start to come up with the process whereby anyone in the New South Wales government who wants to use an AI tool or a process has to go through these steps. As you can see, it's a 69-page document. I think it's actually changed now. So that's one of the challenges we have. It's pretty intense, and it's not meant to be done by one person. This is all available. You can look here, and there's a breakdown of definitions and the like. And again, I'm happy to follow up on that. But what I wanted to show is that from my standpoint, what I'm always saying in our meetings is it's the dialogic benefit of the back and forth between the group wanting to use this technology and the committee seeking to oversee it, and doing that in a trusted space where we know that anything that is said is not going to be used against one or the other. So meetings aren't recorded and nothing leaves the room, but there's been an effort put into building up a genuine sense of trust to raise doubt, to ask questions, and to say, this is what I really want to do, and to be able to take that feedback on. And I think that aspect is really important. The framework is one thing. The process that underlies the operationalizing and the doing of that is essential. Now with community, it's the same thing. How do you work with a community who isn't specialist? I'm mindful, I don't want to go into too much on this, but I would recommend that there are two authors who I take great inspiration from in terms of working with data in community. One is Jared Thorpe, who's written this article, Turning Data Around, that I constantly find myself referencing. And he tells the story in this Medium post about a situation where some data analysts did some, I think it was some analysis of Twitter feeds in New York City. And they identified what they thought was the saddest place in New York City. And it turns out it was a high school. According to their data, it was a high school. And so it became a part of the New York Times story, and people were calling the school to say, oh, why is this such a sad place? Now, I don't know about you, but that rang alarm bells for me when I heard, you know, you think about how vulnerable children are and adolescents, and to suddenly have this label thrown at you. Well, it was an inaccurate label, because as it turned out, the way that the analysis was done was problematic, and there were errors in the document and errors in the process. But also, there was absolutely no effort made to do a referential check by going to the school and saying, hey, we think our data says this. What do you think? Had they done that, they wouldn't have made that error. And so what Jared says, and I just love this phrase, so often data is taken from us and it is never given to us. So why can't we turn data around and create feedback mechanisms, two-way streets, if you like, so that I share what I'm finding and you share what you think I have found and how that relates to your own perspective. take that another step forward, and Georgia Lupi is a data visualizer who's done quite a lot around data visualization. And I can recommend to you this article. Just go search Georgia Lupi data humanism. And she's offering this counter to big data, not because big data isn't useful, but because sometimes to get at that granularity, it's useful to put yourself into a different small context. She has some wonderful artistic ways of doing that I've been adapting. But the other thing that I would recommend you do is look up the book or on the website Dear Data, and you'll see the story of engagement with different ways of visualizing data. So I think having the global picture is valuable, but understanding how to work at that local and building trust with community is a really critical aspect of what we're talking about. And it's why the FAIR framework and the CARE framework really resonated with me in terms of building one step at a time. And thinking about how, in terms of one of the original papers that made CARE as a framework public, says, surely if we're talking about health and well-being, then we should be referring to the community, and they should have some say in the foundational capacities related to this. They should be able to make those decisions. And why that resonated so strongly with me goes back to the steps that I was taking in my own research when I was working with my own form of big data, which was all the qualitative material that had been gathered through 2 years of ethnographic analysis. And in order to make sure that what I was claiming could be supported and defended, I had a series of process tracing and audit trails that were a part of my practice working with that data. And I find that I've been using this now with the students that are trained in data science because it works for quantitative as well as qualitative data. So being mindful and respecting the integration between what you observe, what you collect, and how you then analyze it. And articulating that. Finding ways to have participant-driven approaches that are there so that you're confirming your insight. Using this idea of a criteria of soundness to build confidence in the claims that you're making. And building trust so that you can make data matter. And all of that has gone into this framework that I made public a few years ago. And you'll find that's a freely available paper. I put the link on the last page so you can see. I was part of a group of scholars and policymakers who were invited to do a book for the Australian Computing Society, Data and the Digital Self. And I have a chapter in there where I talk about the role of trust and the history behind the crafting of this framework. And broadly speaking, what I would put to you is that when we're trying to design and work with AI and data technologies, that we need to recognize that some of what we do is shaped by the organizational context we find ourselves in, and therefore it is somewhat in our control. And some of it is shaped by forces outside the organization, and therefore less in our control. I also like the idea of it not so much being, a hierarchical or a linear approach, but rather something almost like a faceted jewel, where you have lots of different ways of actually getting to that design process. And the 4 core elements are data and design, which are really shaped more within an organizational context. And then people and policy, which are important, I'd say absolutely critical, which is what I've been talking about here, but are not always under your control. The reason they're important, though, is for the reasons that I flagged, especially because if you're trying to work with data that seeks to represent society or some aspect of society, it's really important to have that empathic stance to be able to appreciate that perspective and find ways to bring that in. With data, it's really important to understand that how you represent that data has consequences further down the chain. And with design, finding ways for that multi-channel engagement, the two-way streets that Jared Thorpe talks about, front-loading values, and creating in partnership. But to create in partnership, which is co-design, which I hear a lot of people talk about and trying to use, what I would argue is before you even get to that, you have to build trust. And before you even get to that, you have to establish your credibility to show that you are worthy of that trust. And before that, you have to actually be able to work towards acceptance. And this means putting time into that. And before that, you really have to establish your legitimacy to actually do the work that you're setting out to do in the first place. So often people go straight to this because of the timelines that they're dealing with. And what I would put to you is it's really important to do this groundwork, because the more you do here, the more powerful and effective the insights that come out of this, the more genuine and authentic the work that you put in. And the way that you do that, I write about around these ideas of keystone practices. And while these are keystone practices for data, you won't see the reference to data, because this is about building those relations with people, finding ways to have civil discourse, building community, and understanding what is happening on the ground. So I'll leave you with 4 key actions that I would like to think you could take out of here today. The first is finding a way to design with people and not just for them. So even if just in a small way, you start to find ways to design with a group, it becomes a very powerful way to start to look for what's hidden, unnoticed, and potentially incomprehensible. The more diverse the pool from which you are seeking insight, the more comprehensible things become, as the more lenses come to play. Think about artificial intelligence more as augmented intelligence, where it's not an either or, but rather a way to use the machine capacity to augment human insight and creative thought, and look for ways that you can enhance human judgments rather than replace them. And then finally, finding ways to make time to think, to develop the stillness that you need. That's the pause in that framework that I showed before, so that you can seek to make sense of what is visible and not, in the first instance in yourself. And then as you share that in relations with other people and the community. And I connect that to this. So I have a photographic practice where I do some installation work with photos to represent different ideas. And this one, to me, is about making the invisible visible, because it's a photo of a coral reef on the edge of an island. And to take it, I had to walk out into the reef and just stand. And the longer I stood, the stiller I stayed, the more I saw, the more activity that was around, and the more connected I became to the ground that was underneath me and the water and the fish that came up to me. And so that's, to me, that's the making time to think and finding ways for the stillness that allows you to learn from the intuitive gut instinct that is crafted. I think sometimes we underestimate the power of this recording instrument, this data insight that can come. So all of you who are working with data and working in community and dealing with these issues technically, you're also human beings going through the world. So learning to use this instrument alongside the technical tools makes you even more powerful. So thank you very much for your time.
So much for this great talk. So now opening up for questions online or in person. If anyone wants to ask online, you can drop it your question in the Q&A or raise your Zoom hand, and then you can ask it out loud. First, anyone in the room here? To start with one question. On the what's really interesting what you presented about the ethnography of the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, because that's something I use daily almost, and I've never really thought about it critically. Do you have any example of like how now that kind of what's an example of maybe more of a how to phrase this, but of a not a political influence, but some influence on the ICD that may be a good example of how considering what's behind the ICD.
Well, I suppose the example that really sticks out for me because of the experience that a friend of mine had is around chronic fatigue and the different ways that that's classified. I think the other way that I've seen it, and I was talking with Megan about that yesterday at the session, is how causes of death are classified, and the challenge between a primary and a secondary cause, and who determines the primary versus the secondary. Where does that end up, and what are the consequences? So there was an interesting example, and I was talking to Megan because I heard it on the radio and I'm looking for it. But there was a situation many years ago when I was first working as a student on this topic, where I came across an account where there was a hospital where, so it was a particularly cold winter, in the United States. And there were a number of deaths by exposure of people who were homeless, who were brought to hospital and ended up dying. And there was a push to not classify the cause of death as exposure, because it's not a good look to have someone in a modern city die from something. So it was heart failure, flu, viruses. So to me, that has stuck with me all the time to sort of think. And I felt that in a very powerful way with the passing of my own parents, when the cause of death register was there, and I was there at the moment, and the cause was not what was listed. I had a debate, but you're also in that traumatic situation where I had no authority to change this, but I know that there's a different story that has ended up in the public record. And I think the same was happening during COVID. So that, to me, that's where this is such a powerful instrument, and it serves such a necessary function, because that categorization is important for linking data, especially. And in CoData, we explored, I think, Anna, we use that example sometimes around, how when you see a really small number listed against a cause of death, and you have some of that lived experience, you need to go, is it that small a number, or is there a story here? So I think that lesson there is, again, why I think it's important for individuals working in these spaces to also make sure that they're developing that awareness of their sense of being human, and bringing up the values of social justice to this work. To sort of think about the ways that if you recognize something, and if your gut, I'm always telling my students, if your gut is saying something, don't ignore it. Doesn't mean you go to a boss or a CEO and say, well, my gut tells me this is wrong. but there are ways that you develop that voice to sort of understand, why is this sitting so uncomfortably with me? And what can I do? And so I think what it also flags is you don't necessarily have to change the classification, but you change the way you work with it, and you change the way, again, it's not a single source of truth. It is a part of a bigger picture. So what can I do to bring more of that complexity?
I think an example I've seen of that in the US is that's classified by legal intervention.
Yeah.
Police cause death that have implications, legal implications, a lot of implications. So whatever that ends up as an accident or all of that has huge implications.
And I think so the really important message from all of this is to say, just understanding the way that data is used as a weapon of, so Kathy O'Neill, weapon of mass destruction. These are powerful tools. And if you're aware of how powerful they can be, and you are seeking to do good, then in the first instance, you're always trying to be minded of, what do you mean by good? And how does that goodness translate in relation to the communities you work with? How are you validating that goodness? And what, as a consequence of that recognition of a need to raise a voice, how will you do that? How can you do that? Also to protect yourself, it takes a lot of courage.
I'm going to ask one question online by Amel. Thank you for this human-centered presentation. What do you think about modeling data using ontologies to better draw a context for them and avoid bias?
So which ontologies are they talking about? So just ontologies in general? Yeah. So again, I think one of the strengths of the new tools that we have is that you can have multiple voices and multiple approaches. And so, but also it's important to maintain, if you like, the lineage, and to be able to show, okay, what was used and why. So, and certainly think about classification of diseases, okay, there could be other ways of actually classifying, and if there's a way to point to that. I think certainly, I've seen, as part of an event in Canberra in Australia, where there are Indigenous communities who are looking at ways of bringing in the ontologies of Indigenous medicine and healing in plants, which works in a completely different way, in a different framework, which then has those knock-on effects for how everything is presented or understood. And so I think when that lineage is there, and you find ways to connect with people who have the understanding of that particular worldview. Sorry, I think visually, so that's why I'm going like this. So I think there's real power in finding ways to do, in a sense, that multi-method approach, where you're taking the insight from a Western perspective with an insight from another perspective, another ontology, and seeking to just make sense, not because you're trying to merge them. So I think that's the other important thing, is to just be sensitive to, okay, what as a consequence of this can I do in the now? What is my local application of this? And how can I share my understanding in a way that might contribute to others? So I think that's that slowing things down a little bit. I'd like to see us not always working so fast. So one of my favorite, and Chris, I keep pointing to Chris, so David Levy in University of Washington, so a philosopher of information who worked quite a lot in computer systems, and then has written quite a lot about contemplative scholarship. So if you look at any of my work, you'll see reference to David. And he makes this point that, you know, at the very moment, we have all these computational tools to help us to work more, faster, better. We've lost the capacity and the time to think. So we need to make time to think. And I add to that, we need to make time to link, because that's where also it's the linkages, not just with the data, but the linkages with others who understand this. So I hope that helps answer that question.
Great.
First of all, thank you for this talk. I feel like we have so little critical teaching around working with data and thinking about the categories of data, so it's really appreciated. Something that I have been struggling with personally, and I'm interested, is power is very present, and analysis of power was very present in your description of the problem, but I noticed was not so present in your description of the solution. That the solution was much more focused around changing humanistic ideas among users of these algorithms, but ideas were not what forced production companies to drop AI from contracts. It was labor force organized to force those into change. Or the cotton gin, I think, would not have been sidelined by a few plantation owners thinking, well, I think this might be bad for my workers, because there's an economic power incentive.
Yes.
So how do you think about helping build that power, and how do we build power into our conversations about the solutions?
That's a fabulous question. Thank you. And I'm very minded of, you know, the power of the timeline and the power of an introductory presentation. But also, so because structure shapes so much, and this is, I guess, where, you know, the work of Jeff Balker and Star, in particular around infrastructure politics and power, and how hard it is to change. I mean, it's one reason with benefit. I guess it's why I left the academic context. I sought to change, and I reached a point where I felt I couldn't do that anymore, and I was in a position where personally I was able to leave. And I was talking to some people the other day. If I were in the United States, I wouldn't have been able to make that choice because I would have needed healthcare. So the fact that I exist in a country where there was public healthcare meant I could make a decision for myself that was free of a really important, essential part of my day-to-day living and the living of my family. And that's not something I could have changed. If I had wanted to, and I was sitting here, I would have had to deal with that structure. So one of the aspirations I have, and again, the reason why I left to become independent, is I feel it's important to work at a number of different levels to start to offer alternatives. I take such inspiration from the Indigenous technologists I work with, who have a very different way at looking at things and finding alternatives, but also dealing with power imbalances that constrain. So I seek to learn from that and make sense for myself, but also find ways to then engage with practitioners, technologists, so that when you're in an organization, the number of times, so when I was training those data science students, number of times I was almost on speed dial in the middle of the night when they call, they go, okay, here's the problem. Here's what I want to do, and here's what I can't do. What do we do? And that comes down to an individual ethic as to how far do you think you can take something and still protect yourself, which is also why it's important to find ways to mobilize groups to be able to share that like-minded idea. So creating a new form of technology workforce that speaks to it. But I think it's also, and I will flag, I'm a board optimist, so you know, some days I'm pessimistic because it's not that easy, but I think it's also important to work with people in decision-making corridors. And so I've been very fortunate to be able to have a small say in some of the policy decisions in my government context in Australia, but not always, because I'm very often in the too hard basket, but I'm very stubborn. 900 years of history in no place. You know, I don't go away easily. And then also with the public, I think I am so inspired by the engagement in community that I'm seeing. And I think when there are ways for us to reconcile an institutional possession along with personal passion and connected to those communities, educating those publics to let them know that they can speak up. It troubles me immensely when I hear people say, oh, you know, I can't change any of this, and you know, they're doing this with my data. So I'm trying to find ways to educate communities, not to become data scientists, but to become sufficiently data and digital literate so that they'll hold people accountable. Because I think the more organizations and governments are held accountable, the more they have to do this. So, and already I've seen a change. So when I started as director in 2014, and I would speak about these things to companies, there was like, oh yeah, okay, I think we kind of need this. And by the time we left, it's like, okay, now we need a strategy. So it's too slow in some contexts, but if it's not just one person, you know, if all of us start to infect one another with this new way of thinking, you get that inoculation so that you can put up with the inequity. But also I will acknowledge that I'm in a position of privilege to be able to deal with that. And there are people that are not. So again, it's why just sharing it in as many forms as possible and finding ways to connect and to think how we individually, again, going back to what your gut tells you, finding in a sense, not to sound like a motherhood statement, but finding the way that you can channel that interest in that recognition of inequity and injustice to make sure that it doesn't disappear, because the structures around us often make it far too easy for that to exist. And I think there's enough people now fed up. And that's also how you build trust, is by being authentic about that, saying, okay, I want to change this. Here's the reality of my situation. I can't change it overnight, but can you partner with this to find a way to move forward? I hope that helps. And I hope we stay connected on it.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you everyone online too. Just a message from Simon. Thank you.
Oh, lovely.